Evening, and we begin tonight with Donald Trump and the staggering fine. A judge in New York fining Trump $355 million in his civil fraud case for exaggerating the value of his properties, defrauding lenders by inflating the values of his properties for years to get better and bigger loans and insurance deals. The state attorney general had argued if everyday Americans can't exaggerate the values of their properties, why should the Trumps? One property, the Trump Tower penthouse, Trump documents claimed it was 30,000 square feet. Property records show it's actually 10,900 square feet. Mar-a-Lago, Trump said it was worth up to $600 million. Appraisers in Florida put it at $27 million, just a fraction.
He's complaining this is a very unfair trial. I hope the public is watching. In his ruling today, the judge knocked Trump's testimony for long, irrelevant speeches, adding his refusal to answer the questions directly or in some cases at all severely compromised his credibility. The judge today also punishing Trump's two eldest sons, Eric and Don Jr., who Trump entrusted with the company when he was president. Both brothers had testified all they did was sign documents their accountants prepared, insisting they didn't check what was actually in them.
Whoever was bringing me a document, if it was more accounting, it was probably from accounting. If it was more legal, it would be from legal. And are we okay signing this document? Do you believe it to be honest and accurate? And if they were okay with it,
Picture spending your entire adult life constructing a real estate empire so massive that your last name gleams in gold across the Manhattan skyline. Towers, hotels, office buildings, golf courses, all branded, all marketed as symbols of dominance and success. For decades, that image has been central to Donald Trump's identity. The buildings weren't just investments, they were proof of power. Now imagine a judge in a New York courtroom calmly stating that the state might have the authority to take those very properties away, not fine him lightly, not issue a warning, but potentially seize the assets themselves. It sounds cinematic, almost unbelievable in modern America. Yet for a brief and very intense moment in 2024, that possibility was not political theater. It was legal reality. What unfolded was not about tweets, classified documents, or campaign speeches. This time, the spotlight shifted to something far more fundamental: money. Specifically, how Trump valued his properties, how he presented his wealth to banks and insurers, and whether those numbers were truthful. After years of investigation, a New York judge concluded that Trump and his company had significantly inflated property valuations in order to secure more favorable loan terms and insurance deals. According to the court's findings, this was not a minor exaggeration or routine business optimism. The ruling stated that his net worth had been overstated by billions of dollars, billions, and the penalty that followed was staggering, a civil fraud judgment totaling $454 million. That number alone sent shockwaves through political and financial circles. Nearly $500 million is not a routine fine, even for someone who claims billionaire status. And it wasn't just the size of the judgment that made it explosive, it was the timeline attached to it. The amount carried interest, meaning the longer it went unpaid, the larger it became. Every single day added to the total. This wasn't a distant obligation that could be casually addressed months down the road. It was immediate, pressing, and financially suffocating. Trump publicly denounced the ruling as a politically motivated attack, labeling it a witch hunt designed to damage him. But regardless of rhetoric, the court order stood. The money was owed. Here is where the story took a dramatic turn. Under New York law, when someone fails to satisfy a court judgment, the state has enforcement mechanisms at its disposal. Those mechanisms are not symbolic. They include placing liens on properties, freezing accounts, and, if necessary, seizing and selling assets to recover what is owed. New York Attorney General Letitia James made it clear that her office was prepared to pursue those options if Trump did not pay. She stated publicly that asset seizure was on the table, not hypothetically, not as a distant possibility, as an actionable next step. The properties mentioned were not small holdings tucked away out of sight. They included Trump Tower and 40 Wall Street, landmark buildings deeply tied to Trump's brand. The idea of state officials initiating seizure proceedings against those properties was almost surreal. For decades, Trump cultivated the persona of an untouchable mogul who always emerged stronger from controversy. The prospect of government authorities targeting the very buildings that defined his public image challenged that narrative in a profound way. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about reputation, identity, and the illusion of invincibility. As deadlines approached, the pressure intensified. The court required Trump either to pay the full $454 million or post a bond covering that amount while he appealed the decision. Securing a bond of that size is not as simple as writing a check. Bonding companies demand collateral and extensive assurances before assuming that level of financial risk. Reports indicated that Trump's legal team struggled to find a company willing to underwrite such a massive bond under the circumstances. The clock was ticking, and the possibility of enforcement loomed closer with each passing day. As the deadline drew closer, the situation shifted from dramatic to urgent. This was no longer about fiery speeches outside the courthouse or combative posts on social media. It was about a hard date on the calendar. If Trump failed to secure the required bond or pay the full judgment, New York officials could begin enforcement procedures almost immediately. That meant paperwork filed, properties identified, legal steps initiated, and potentially the first moves toward taking control of assets that had carried his name for decades. Behind closed doors, lawyers were scrambling. Negotiations with bonding companies were reportedly tense. The number was simply enormous, and the risk for any underwriter was just as large. Trump's legal team turned to the appeals court seeking relief. They argued that obtaining a bond for the full $454 million was practically impossible and would cause irreparable harm to his business operations. It was a high-stakes request because without intervention, the state would have clear authority to act. In a move that surprised many observers, the appellate court granted partial relief. Instead of requiring a bond covering the entire judgment, it reduced the amount to $175 million while the appeal proceeded. That decision did not erase the original ruling. It did not declare Trump innocent, but it dramatically lowered the immediate financial barrier and bought him critical time. Even at $175 million, the figure was staggering. Yet compared to nearly $500 million, it was a lifeline. Trump managed to secure and post the reduced bond just hours before enforcement actions could have begun. The timing was razor thin. Had that bond not been filed when it was, the state might have moved forward with asset seizure proceedings. For a brief window, the machinery of enforcement was ready. The difference between keeping his empire intact and facing the public spectacle of property seizure came down to last-minute legal maneuvering and a scaled-down bond requirement. Throughout this ordeal, Trump reacted with visible fury. In court filings and public statements, he accused the judge of bias and characterized the Attorney General's actions as politically motivated. He framed the case as part of a broader campaign to undermine him and damage his brand. His supporters echoed those claims, arguing that the investigation had always been politically driven. Critics, however, pointed to the judge's detailed findings, which outlined years of inflated valuations presented to lenders and insurers. They argued that the ruling reflected a straightforward application of civil fraud law, not partisan revenge. Beneath the political shouting match lies a more complex financial reality. Real estate wealth is often tied up in physical assets rather than liquid cash. A person may own properties worth hundreds of millions on paper, yet struggle to produce vast sums of cash on short notice. The case exposed that tension. If Trump's holdings are indeed as valuable as he claims, why was securing a bond so difficult? Was it purely a matter of liquidity? Or did bonding companies assess risk differently based on the court's findings? These are uncomfortable questions because Trump's public persona has long centered on the idea of limitless financial strength. The near-seizure moment also carried symbolic weight. The image of state officials potentially moving to claim control over Trump Tower would have been broadcast across every major network and platform. It would have signaled that even a former president and sitting political powerhouse could face the same enforcement mechanisms applied to ordinary defendants. That symbolism is powerful in a country that often debates whether wealth and influence create a different set of rules. For some, the case demonstrated accountability. For others, it reinforced fears of political weaponization. Either way, the implications stretched far beyond one courtroom. To really understand how things escalated to this point, you have to rewind and look at the foundation of the case itself. This did not appear out of nowhere. The civil fraud investigation had been building for years, examining financial statements, loan applications, and internal records tied to Trump's business operations. At the center of it all was a straightforward but serious allegation that property values were being presented one way to lenders in order to secure favorable financing, and presented another way when it came time to deal with taxes or other obligations. In simple terms, the state argued you cannot inflate values when it benefits you and deflate them when it saves you money. The court ultimately agreed. The judge's ruling laid out examples where valuations appeared dramatically higher than independent assessments suggested. According to the findings, these inflated figures helped Trump secure loans with better interest rates and more favorable terms. The impact of those financial advantages over time can be enormous. Even a small interest rate difference on large commercial loans can translate into millions of dollars saved. Multiply that across multiple properties and years of transactions, and the numbers compound quickly. That is why the court treated the issue as serious misconduct rather than harmless exaggeration. In the judge's view, this was not routine business optimism. It was a pattern that distorted financial reality. Trump and his legal team strongly rejected that characterization. They argued that real estate valuation is inherently subjective and that properties are often worth what buyers are willing to pay. They insisted that lenders conducted their own due diligence and were not misled. From their perspective, this was standard industry practice being unfairly criminalized. But the court concluded otherwise in the civil context, determining that the evidence supported a finding of fraud under New York law. The $454 million judgment was designed not only to penalize past conduct, but to strip away what the court viewed as improperly obtained financial benefits. This is where the story moves beyond one individual and becomes a broader debate about power and accountability. Trump is not just a businessman, he is a political figure with enormous influence. When someone of that stature faces a judgment of this magnitude, it inevitably triggers questions about fairness. Supporters see political motivation. Critics see overdue consequences. The truth is that both law and politics can exist in the same space, especially when the defendant is a former president. What makes this moment unique is how close enforcement came to altering the physical landscape of his empire. If the appeals ultimately fail and the full judgment stands, the financial pressure returns in full force. The bond he posted merely pauses enforcement while the appeal is reviewed. It does not erase the debt. If the higher courts uphold the ruling, Trump would once again face the obligation to pay the full amount plus accrued interest, and interest on hundreds of millions of dollars adds up quickly. The Attorney General has already stated that her office is prepared to pursue collection if necessary. That means the threat of asset seizure remains alive, even if temporarily delayed. There is also the reputational dimension, which may be just as significant as the financial one. Trump's brand has always revolved around success, dominance, and the image of a master dealmaker. Being publicly ordered to pay nearly $500 million for financial misrepresentation strikes at that image. The scramble to secure a bond, the last-minute court relief, and the looming possibility of asset seizure all contrast sharply with the persona of effortless wealth. In politics, perception can be as powerful as reality. And this episode has forced even longtime observers to reassess assumptions about the strength and structure of his empire. Now we arrive at the larger question that hangs over everything. What does this actually mean going forward? Because despite the dramatic headlines and the near miss with asset seizure, the case is not finished. The appeals process is still unfolding, and that process could take months or longer. During that time, the reduced bond of $175 million acts as a temporary shield, preventing the state from moving forward with enforcement. But make no mistake, it is only a pause button. If the appellate courts uphold the original ruling, the full $454 million judgment comes roaring back into focus, along with the accumulating interest that continues ticking upward in the background. If that happens, Trump would again face the same stark choice: pay the full amount or risk enforcement. And enforcement in this context is not symbolic. It means liens, frozen accounts, and potentially the seizure and sale of properties to satisfy the judgment. The Attorney General has been consistent and public about that possibility. She has not softened her stance or walked back her statements. From her perspective, this is about applying the law as written and enforcing a court's decision. From Trump's perspective, it remains a politically charged assault on his business and reputation. Those two narratives are colliding in real time, and the outcome will carry consequences that stretch well beyond one individual. There is also a constitutional and political layer that makes this moment historic. Trump is not just a former president, he is an active political force and once again the sitting president. The idea that a state court could move toward financially crippling someone who holds or has held the highest office in the country challenges assumptions about power in America. For some, it reinforces the principle that no one is above the law. For others, it raises concerns about how legal systems can intersect with political rivalry. Either way, the fact that enforcement came within hours of beginning shows how real the stakes were. Financially, this episode has sparked renewed scrutiny of Trump's business structure. Wealth on paper does not always translate into immediate liquidity. Large real estate portfolios often rely on leverage, refinancing, and long-term asset appreciation rather than piles of cash sitting in accounts. The difficulty in securing the original bond fueled speculation about how liquid his holdings truly are and how lenders assess risk when controversy enters the equation. Even if he ultimately prevails on appeal, the public exposure of those vulnerabilities has already shifted perception in subtle but meaningful ways. At its core, this story is about accountability and the durability of institutions. The legal system issued a judgment. The enforcement mechanisms were activated. Political rhetoric erupted. And in the end, a last-minute appellate decision prevented an unprecedented spectacle of property seizure. But the closeness of that moment is what makes it so significant. For a brief period, the system appeared ready to dismantle pieces of an empire that many believed untouchable. That reality alone marks this as one of the most consequential financial and legal battles involving a modern American president. And here is the truth. We are still in the middle of it. Appeals are pending. Deadlines will return. Interest continues to accrue. The tension between political power and legal accountability has not been resolved. It has merely been delayed. Whether this ends with a reduced penalty, a reversed ruling, or a renewed enforcement push remains to be seen. What is certain is that the next chapter could be just as dramatic as the last. If you want clear breakdowns of what happens next, how the appeals unfold, and what it could mean for Trump's empire and American politics, make sure you stay locked in. Follow, subscribe, and share this analysis so you don't miss the developments ahead, because this story is far from over and the consequences could reshape the narrative in ways few people expected.